At some point, without announcing it, you became a teacher. Not the kind you intended to become, not the parent who sits down and explains values, who models courage in some legible way, who chooses words carefully and delivers them at the right moment. You became the other kind, the one whose entire interior life has been running as a course of instruction for years, without your knowing what the curriculum contains. There is a specific thing that most parents never examine, and that most people who were parented never see clearly until it is too late to be surprised by it. The most permanent transmission between generations is not what was said. It is what the person doing the saying could not bring themselves to face. Your child is not primarily reading your words. They are reading the shape of your evasions, the texture of your anxiety when certain subjects arise, the way your body shifts in the presence of certain kinds of uncertainty, the things you redirect away from without naming them, the subjects that receive a particular quality of silence. These are not peripheral features of your relationship with your child. They are the primary text. This is the mechanism that has been operating beneath every deliberate parenting choice you've made, and beneath every deliberate choice your own parents made. It doesn't require intention. It doesn't require repetition. A single consistent pattern of what cannot be faced, held in the presence of a child over years, is sufficient to transmit a world model. And the world model being transmitted is not the one you would choose if you were asked. There is a name for what the child learns in this register. It is not lesson, it is not value, it is calibration. The child's developing sense of what kinds of things produce, what kinds of responses in the person who is their primary map of reality. The calibration happens without language. It happens in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of attention and avoidance that form before the child has any framework for understanding what they're absorbing. By the time they have language for it, the calibration is already complete. They will spend the rest of their lives experiencing it as their own personality, their own preferences, their own relationship with difficulty. They will not know it was delivered. This is not a marginal problem. This is the central problem of intergenerational transmission, and it goes almost entirely unexamined, not because people are incurious, but because the mechanism by which parents transmit their evasions is the same mechanism by which they were taught not to look at them. You were educated very thoroughly in how not to examine certain things, and you learned it from someone who had been equally well educated. Naming this does not produce guilt, or it shouldn't. What it produces, when it lands correctly, is a specific kind of clarity, the possibility of becoming the kind of person whose unexamined life is no longer the primary text your child is reading. That requires first being able to see what has been in the text, and most people cannot, not because they lack intelligence or intention, but because the curriculum of avoidance is taught precisely in the register where it cannot be examined. That register is what this script is going to name. If this channel is reaching something you haven't found elsewhere, subscribe. That's how it reaches the people who need it. The curriculum of avoidance is this course of instruction running beneath your deliberate parenting has several subjects. Each is taught not through speech, but through performance. And the performance is not voluntary. You are not deciding to run it. You are running it the way a fever runs, not as a choice, but as the expression of something that is already happening in you, and that the presence of a child simply makes visible to a witness who cannot yet understand what they're witnessing. Erich Fromm wrote about the way the majority of people resolve their encounter with freedom not by engaging it, but by escaping it, by attaching to structures, authorities, and identities that relieve them of the burden of genuine self-determination. He was writing about adults, about the social and political consequences of this flight from the open question. But the more precise and devastating version of what he saw is this. The escape from freedom is not primarily transmitted to children as ideology or argument. It is transmitted as atmosphere. When a parent's relationship with genuine uncertainty, with the question that has no safe answer, with a choice that cannot be made without real cost, is one of managed avoidance, the child does not hear a message about how to handle these things. They absorb a demonstration. And the demonstration is not subtle. The demonstration is the full-body presence of a person they trust and depend on, in contact with a certain kind of difficulty, producing a certain kind of response. The child learns this is what difficulty looks like. This is the appropriate response. This is how large a person can be in the presence of what is hard. The calibration is set not by what was said about difficulty, but by what difficulty looked like in the body of the person they were watching. What Fromm also saw, and this is the part that most treatments of his work skip, is that the person who has escaped from freedom does not experience themselves as having escaped from anything. They experience themselves as having arrived at wisdom, at realism, at an appropriate relationship with what is actually possible. This is the specific quality that makes the transmission so efficient. The parent is not aware of performing a curriculum. They are aware of being correct, and the child does not receive it as avoidance. They receive it as the shape of the real. Now bring in Jung, and the picture becomes even more specific. Jung called what parents fail to confront the unlived life, and he was precise, more precise than most treatments of the concept acknowledge, about where it goes when it doesn't go anywhere. It does not simply remain in the parent, contained, inert, waiting. It migrates. The energy that cannot find expression in the parent's own choices, the desire or the grief or the ambition or the rage that was foreclosed or suppressed or simply never examined, this does not disappear from the relational field. It enters the relationship with the child as a kind of pressure. The unlived life of the parent becomes the pressure the child experiences as their own desire. Take a moment with that. The parent who could not become the painter, who knows this, who has processed it, who does not mention it, who would be genuinely surprised to hear it described as something they are communicating, has nonetheless communicated something, not the fact of the foreclosed ambition, the energy of it, the particular quality of charged attention that attaches to that territory. The child raised in proximity to an unlived life often develops an odd relationship with the domain in question, a pull toward it that feels inexplicable, or an avoidance of it that feels like preference, or a compulsion to succeed in it that carries a weight out of proportion to the child's own relationship with the work. The child does not know the source. They experience the pressure as their own. They may spend years, decades, acting from a motivation whose actual origin is somewhere else, somewhere in the previous generation's unfinished business, somewhere in the grief that was never named. This is Jung's concept of projection at the level of the entire life orientation, not merely the isolated interaction. The shadow of the parent, the unacknowledged, unexamined, unintegrated portions of the parent's psyche, does not sit behind glass. It enters the relationship as texture, as atmosphere, as the particular quality of attention the parent cannot give to certain subjects and cannot withhold from subjects that carry charge. The child is the most accurate mirror the parent has ever stood in front of. And most parents spend the child's entire formation avoiding looking at what the mirror shows. Apply this to something mundane, not to the obvious subjects, not to the topics that are visibly difficult and acknowledged as such. Apply it to dinner. The question the child asks that produces an almost imperceptible shift in the parent's posture. The subject that gets redirected so smoothly that no one in the room could name the redirection if asked, not even the parent who performed it. The mood that arrives and is explained as work, as tiredness, as something external, when its actual origin is a recognition the parent is in the middle of not making. Children are not fooled by these redirections. They simply don't have the vocabulary to say so. They register the shift. They learn the shape of it. And what they are learning, what is being inscribed in the calibration, is this. This is a kind of thing that produces this kind of response. File it. Know it. This is the map. The map they are building using this data is the map they will carry into every adult relationship, every encounter with difficulty, every moment when something in them is activated that they cannot account for. They will not know the map was given to them. They will experience it as perception. They will trust it the way you trust your own eyes. Now, here is where it becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Nietzsche's analysis of ressentiment, the specific psychological configuration in which resentment is turned inward, reprocessed, and transmuted into moral authority, is most commonly applied to political or social dynamics. But there is a version of ressentiment that operates in families with a particular efficiency that Nietzsche did not fully develop and that his framework nonetheless makes visible. The resentment that cannot be acknowledged as resentment because it is directed at one's own choices, at one's own life as it actually went, at the foreclosed possibilities that feel too exposing to name. This resentment does not disappear. It discovers a host. It presents itself as wisdom, as earned authority, as the hard-won understanding of someone who has been through things. Don't get your hopes up. Said with genuine tenderness, said out of real love, real desire, to protect this child from the cost of disappointment. The child hears someone who loves you, someone who knows more than you, someone whose love you depend on, is telling you this. It must be true about the world. What the child does not hear, what cannot be heard at that age, in that relational position from that source, is this is what this person does with the thing they could not bring themselves to hope for. They teach you not to either. And they have constructed a moral framework around this instruction, a framework in which the teaching of diminished expectation is love, is protection, is the responsible opposite of the naivety. It is actually the residue of. Ressentiment in Nietzsche's analysis does not present itself as resentment. It presents itself as the truth about how things are, which is precisely what makes it the most transmissible of all the psychological configurations a parent carries. You cannot argue with the truth about how things are. You cannot locate the bitterness underneath it, especially when it is delivered by the person whose judgment is your entire frame of reference. The child grows up and finds in their own adult life a strange heaviness in certain kinds of ambition, a voice that sounds remarkably like clarity, a feeling that hope is a form of inexperience that they have fortunately been spared. They do not know this was installed. They experience it as their own hard-won realism, and they may in turn deliver it to their own children, carefully, tenderly, out of real love, as protection. This is how a posture toward life travels across generations, without anyone deciding to transmit it, without anyone being cruel, without anyone knowing they are teaching anything at all. Viktor Frankl wrote that the space between stimulus and response is where the human being actually lives. That in this space lies the capacity to choose who one is in relation to what arrives. The person who has developed this space, who has practiced inhabiting it, who has a relationship with the pause between what happens and what they do about it, is qualitatively different from the person for whom stimulus and response are nearly fused, for whom the reactive pattern is the only available mode because no other mode was ever demonstrated as possible. Now apply this to the parent not as philosopher, but as demonstrator. The parent who has almost no space between stimulus and response, who is immediately reactive in the presence of certain kinds of emotional content, who contracts sharply at ambiguity, who cannot remain present with difficulty without immediately moving toward resolution or deflection. This parent is not simply reacting. They are calibrating the child's sense of what the available space is. They are teaching, through consistent demonstration over years, that this is the natural size of the gap, that this is how an adult meets what is hard, that the speed of the reactive collapse is appropriate, is normal, is human. The child does not receive this as a lesson about the parent. They receive it as a lesson about reality, about what difficulty does to a person, about what is survivable and in what way. And here is the specific mechanism by which the transmission becomes self-concealing. The child who was calibrated to a small space does not, in adulthood, experience themselves as carrying a limitation. They experience the small space as the accurate size of the space. There is no sense of having been given less than what exists. There does not appear to be more available. They are not suppressing something. They were shown a particular range, and they live within it as if it were the whole range. They will watch other people inhabit a larger space and experience this not as evidence that a larger space is available, but as evidence that those people are somehow constitutionally different, naturally calmer, less affected, born into a different category of person. They were not born into a different category of person. They were demonstrated a different range. Hannah Arendt made an observation that seems to be about political life, but cuts directly into the domestic thinking, the actual activity of interior examination, of refusing to accept the first answer, of sitting with a question in genuine uncertainty until the answer that emerges is genuinely one's own, is not a natural human activity. It is acquired. It requires having observed somewhere in one's formation a person doing it, not explaining it, not endorsing it, doing it, visibly sustaining contact with the not yet known, visibly tolerating the discomfort of the unresolved without immediately collapsing it into a conclusion. Arendt's specific concern was with the moral consequences of not thinking, with what she called the banality of evil, the observation that atrocity is not primarily perpetrated by monsters, but by ordinary people who have simply ceased to examine what they are doing and why. The mechanism she identified was not cruelty. It was the suspension of genuine interior dialogue, the replacement of real thought with received categories, stock phrases, the language of whoever held authority in a given context. The person who does not think in Arendt's sense is not deficient in intelligence. They are deficient in the habit of interrogating their own premises. They have learned somewhere from someone that the received answer is sufficient, that the inherited frame is adequate, that there is no particular reason to ask whether what one has been told is actually true. This learning happens in childhood. It happens in the specific register of watching how the adult world handles questions that do not have comfortable answers. The child who asks a genuine question, not a factual question, but a real question, the kind that has no clean resolution, and receives in return a deflection delivered with confidence, a received answer offered as closure, a performance of certainty that does not invite further inquiry. This child is learning something about the activity of thinking itself. They are learning its social function. They are learning that thinking is something you perform, that conclusions are something you arrive at quickly and hold firmly, that the display of not knowing is a vulnerability rather than an honest position. The parent who cannot think in this sense, who is not comfortable sitting with the open question, who closes loops quickly because open loops are intolerable, who defaults to received answers because genuinely wrestling with a question means risking that the answer will not be comfortable. This parent is teaching something specific and consequential. They are teaching that thinking is not necessary, that a full and functioning adult life does not require the examination of one's own premises, that the received answer is sufficient, that the inherited frame is adequate, that it is, in fact, slightly inappropriate to press further. And they are, in practical terms, correct. You can get through an entire life this way. You can be responsible, employed, loving, well-regarded, and never genuinely examine a single premise you were handed. The social world does not require thinking in Arendt's sense. It often actively discourages it. The question is what you are teaching the person who is watching you demonstrate that the received answer is enough. Dostoevsky's Underground Man is useful here, not as psychological diagnosis, but as phenomenological description. The person who knows somewhere that they are performing a version of themselves, who is aware in some register below speech of the gap between what they present and what they actually think or feel or want, and who cannot stop. Not because the performance is pleasurable, because stopping would require a reckoning with what is underneath. And the underground man has organized his entire life around not making that reckoning. He suffers voluntarily. He maintains the suffering because the alternative, facing what he is actually like, what he has actually done or not done, what he actually believes, is more threatening than the suffering itself. The underground man is, in Dostoevsky's rendering, a man of extreme self-awareness, who nonetheless cannot act from that self-awareness. He knows. He simply cannot move from knowing to facing. The self-knowledge has become its own kind of trap. He is aware enough to see the performance, too invested in it to stop, and intelligent enough to produce an endless supply of justifications for why the performance is actually the honest version of himself. He is perhaps the most accurate portrait in literature of what happens when consciousness and avoidance occupy the same person at the same time. They do not cancel each other out. They produce a very particular kind of suffering that the sufferer experiences as depth. Most parents are not the underground man in their entire lives, but most parents are the underground man in particular rooms, on particular subjects, in the presence of particular kinds of questions that arrive, usually from their children, in the specific voice of genuine curiosity that has not yet learned what not to ask. The child who asks the question that makes the parent the underground man for a moment, the question that lands in the exact region of the unexamined, does not receive an answer. They receive a deflection or a redirect or a performance of having answered. And here is the thing, the deflection is often smooth. It often sounds like an answer. The parent is practiced at it. They have been running this particular avoidance for years, and it has acquired the fluency of genuine response. The child is not fooled. They do not have words for what they register. What they register is a shift, the specific quality of not being met that is different from the ordinary texture of conversation. They learn. This is a place we do not go, not because anyone said so, because the conversation itself changed shape when they arrived there. They will spend years feeling the weight of that place without being able to name it. And when their own children ask them the same question, they will feel the same contraction, unfamiliar in its source, entirely familiar in its texture, and they will deliver the same deflection, and they will tell themselves they handled it well. They will mean this sincerely. They will have no idea that what they handled was themselves. You are teaching a curriculum. The question is only whether you know what it contains. Most people, when they sit with this, honestly find two things. The first is that a significant portion of what they are transmitting is what they would choose: genuine love, genuine curiosity in some domains, genuine resilience in others. The second is that another portion of what they are transmitting is precisely what they most wanted to spare their child from. And the tragic specificity of this is not that it is accidental. It is that the things you most want to protect your child from are almost always the things you are most consistently demonstrating, because they are the things you cannot stop reacting to, because they are the places where your own formation was most thorough, where the calibration was set deepest, where the curriculum you received was delivered with the most consistency. The parent who was taught that emotional exposure is danger teaches their child to manage emotion rather than feel it, not by saying don't feel things, but by demonstrating year after year the careful management of exposure, the small and constant practices of containment, the way a person arranges their interior life so that certain things do not surface. The child watches. The child learns the arrangement. The child in adulthood experiences the arrangement as their own preference for privacy, their own strength, their own healthy self-sufficiency. They have no memory of learning it. They were not taught, they were shown. Fromm's biophilous orientation. The character that moves toward life, toward the genuinely new and genuinely unknown, that can tolerate the encounter with what it does not yet understand without immediately needing to resolve it, is not a personality type that people are born with in fixed quantities. It is largely an orientation that is transmitted, not through instruction, through the texture of what was modeled in the first years of life, in the relationships where the world was first encountered as a particular kind of place. The child who watches a parent meet the genuinely unknown with curiosity rather than management, with actual not knowing rather than the performance of flexibility, learns something that no amount of telling could deliver, that the unknown is survivable. That contact with what you do not yet understand does not require immediate defense. That you can be a person who does not know something and remain present, remain intact, remain oriented. This is not a minor transmission. This is the difference between a life spent in genuine contact with experience and a life spent in carefully managed proximity to it. You were the child who was watching once. You know something, if you are willing to look, about what was in the curriculum you received. You know the rooms you were taught to avoid. You know the questions that produced the quality of silence that taught you they were not questions. You know the shape of what was demonstrated to you as the appropriate response to difficulty, to ambiguity, to the genuinely hard choice. You carry this, you have been carrying it, and you have been teaching it because that is what we do with the curriculum we received. We run it until we become aware enough of its contents to begin slowly to teach something different, not by deciding to, not by sitting your child down and correcting the record, but by beginning in the places where you have been the underground man to actually face what you have been not facing, in their presence, without drama, without announcing it, simply by being in those moments a person who can tolerate the contact. The child is not watching for success. They are not watching for resolution. They are watching to find out whether contact with the hard thing is survivable, whether a person can remain themselves in its presence, whether the territory you have taught them is dangerous, is actually dangerous, or only appeared so because the person they were watching could not enter it without changing. That demonstration, the quiet, unannounced, ongoing demonstration of what is actually survivable, is the only pedagogy that reaches the level where the calibration was set. Everything else is words, and they already know what to do with your words.